When Richard Thomas made the unexpected decision to step away from portraying John-Boy Walton, it left fans in disbelief. For so many, John-Boy wasn't just a character. He was the emotional heartbeat of the Waltons, the young dreamer whose thoughtful narration and deep sensitivity held the entire Walton family together. So when he quietly exited and a different actor took over, it raised a lingering question. Why would anyone abandon such a successful role? Initially, it looked like a typical career move. Actors switch roles all the time. But with time and hindsight, it became clear that something more profound was at play. This wasn't just about contract issues or curiosity about other roles. Richard's decision was intensely personal, filled with emotional complexity, and spoke to the deeper struggles of identity, autonomy, and the invisible weight of playing a character who became inseparable from his real-life image. Behind the scenes, Thomas began facing internal unrest. His creative aspirations stretched far beyond the show's mountain setting. While the series remained a ratings powerhouse, Richard increasingly felt stifled, trapped inside the skin of a character who had stopped growing. What began as a fulfilling acting challenge eventually turned into a role that threatened to consume his individuality. Still, there was no controversy, no drama. Richard's departure was handled with grace, and in that silence, fans were left with questions. What truly prompted his exit from one of TV's most adored families? Only years later, through reflection and carefully chosen insights, did Richard Thomas finally open up. And once you hear his truth, you'll never view John-Boy or Richard the same way again. Richard Thomas wasn't new to acting when the Waltons began. He had already appeared in numerous television dramas and Broadway shows and had shared the screen with legends like Paul Newman and Julie Christie. He was a trained, respected performer. But none of that could have predicted the cultural explosion he'd become when the Waltons premiered in 1972. Set during the Great Depression, the show brought families a comforting, value-driven story amid the turbulence of the 1970s. At the core was John-Boy Walton, a bookish, sincere, and morally centered young man whose writing dreams symbolized hope and perseverance. And Richard Thomas inhabited the role so fully, so authentically, that audiences didn't just watch John-Boy, they believed in him. Part of that realism came from how closely John-Boy's character mirrored Richard's own upbringing. Raised in a cultured New York family, surrounded by literature and the arts, Thomas brought his own intellectual curiosity to the screen. His introspection, emotional intelligence, and honesty translated effortlessly into the character. It wasn't long before accolades followed. Thomas won an Emmy in the show's second season, and suddenly he was everywhere. Featured in magazines, booked on national interviews, treated as the face of wholesome American television. By the age of 21, he was not just portraying John-Boy. He had become him in the eyes of a nation. But fame carries a shadow. The longer Richard stayed in the role, the more it began to overtake his personal identity. What once felt like an inspiring challenge now began to feel like a repetitive script. John-Boy was morally flawless, almost saintly, and Richard, a young man still figuring out his own place in the world, started to feel boxed in. The impact was immediate. Richard Thomas won an Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a drama series by the show's second season. He was suddenly on magazine covers, morning talk shows, and television specials. The once reserved theater actor had become a household name, and John-Boy was the reason why. At just 21 years old, Richard became the face of one of America's most beloved programs. But fame came with a price. As the show's popularity soared, so did the expectations. Richard was not just acting anymore, he was carrying a network hit, episode after episode, often filming under intense schedules with very little downtime. His days were long, his scripts constant, and the pressure to deliver never let up. And even though The Waltons was known for its heartwarming tone, the grind behind the scenes was very real. Privately, Richard began feeling a growing disconnection between who he really was and who fans expected him to be. John-Boy was wholesome, poetic, almost too perfect. But Richard, he was still growing, still changing, and quietly beginning to wonder if he was becoming stuck in someone else's story. He was proud of the work, but unsure how much longer he could carry the weight of a character who never seemed to evolve. And as much as he loved the role, that quiet question, "Is this all I am allowed to be?" was starting to grow louder. He still delivered powerful performances, but beneath the surface, a question was quietly emerging. How much longer could he play someone who no longer reflected his own evolving self? Part 3. A spotlight he never wanted. For most rising stars, national fame is the dream. For Richard Thomas, it was a complex burden. He was never someone who chased after the limelight. Fame was something that happened to him, not something he sought, and soon the attention felt invasive rather than flattering. He described his life as being lived in a glass bowl. Fans would stop him on the street, calling him John-Boy with warmth and familiarity. But that closeness came at a cost. People no longer saw him. They saw only the character. That disconnect grew over time. Admirers expected Richard to behave like the ever-noble John-Boy. But he was still young, still learning, and still desiring freedom to make mistakes, explore darker emotions, and take risks. But any departure from the perfect son persona risked fan backlash, and that pressure started to erode his sense of self. Journalists didn't help. Interviews centered almost exclusively around the Waltons. Even when he appeared in grittier roles, the press pulled the conversation back to his signature part. It didn't matter what he did. He was constantly being dragged back to the mountain. Privately, he admitted that the role model image felt more like a performance than his actual acting work. And worse, it limited his opportunities. Casting directors doubted whether audiences could accept him in challenging or morally complex parts. As a result, his own career began to feel like a prison built from his greatest success. The media only added to the pressure. Tabloids and interviews focused almost entirely on his wholesome image. Even as he took on more serious work outside the show, roles that were darker, more challenging, interviewers always pulled the conversation back to the Waltons. They wanted the same story, the same gentle voice, the same moral clarity. And it was exhausting. Behind closed doors, Richard admitted that being a role model on that scale felt more like a performance than his actual acting. There was a growing dissonance between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. And the longer he stayed in the role, the more that dissonance threatened to erode his creative spirit. Even worse, he began noticing how the fame was changing how people treated him. Directors saw him as that good boy from television. Casting agents hesitated to offer him edgier roles. He was in a sense typecast in real life, trapped by the very success he had worked so hard to earn. And the part that hurt the most? Knowing that if he ever left the show, if he dared to walk away, he would disappoint the very audience that had lifted him up. That burden sat on his shoulders for years, quietly like a weight he could never quite shake. And while he never lashed out or courted scandal, Richard knew the clock was ticking. He could either remain forever cast in the same mold or walk away and risk everything to rediscover his own voice. Part 4. Creative Struggles. Behind the camera, by the 5th season, Richard's concerns had grown too big to ignore. His character, while still beloved, had stopped evolving. He proposed adding more depth to John-Boy, giving him inner turmoil, doubt, and challenges that mirrored real adult growth. But the show's creative team pushed back. They wanted consistency, not change. To Richard, that stagnation was stifling. As an actor trained in complexity and nuance, he longed to portray a fuller range of emotion, but John-Boy was locked into being a moral compass, not a flawed human being. He tried pushing back quietly, suggesting changes, offering insights. But the writers stuck to their formula, fearing that altering the character would alienate their loyal viewership. Even though Richard had won accolades and carried the show's emotional weight, his creative input was rarely taken seriously. That mismatch became increasingly unbearable. Day after day, script after script, he found himself saying the same lines with the same emotional tone. It became mechanical. And for an artist, that kind of repetition isn't just dull, it's soul-crushing. To make things worse, producers leaned harder on John-Boy's storylines, increasing his workload and reducing his personal time. His life became consumed by the show, and the emotional toll was mounting. He also saw how his fame was narrowing his career. New casting opportunities passed him by because directors couldn't envision him beyond the mountain. He was becoming a victim of his own success. At the same time, the scripts themselves were beginning to feel stale to him. He had memorized John-Boy's emotional beats so well that they no longer challenged him. Each new episode felt like a variation of the one before. And for an actor committed to growth, repetition was not comforting. It was numbing. Even worse, he started to feel like the show was relying too heavily on John-Boy to carry its emotional weight. Storylines began to center more and more around his character, and Richard found himself constantly working, constantly shooting, often with little room for rest or personal time. It was a grind, and there was little flexibility. He was not just the star, he was the foundation, and the pressure was quietly eating away at him. And then there was the typecasting. Richard saw the writing on the wall. Every time he auditioned for a role outside the series, casting agents would ask the same question. Can we really see John-Boy doing this? He realized that the longer he stayed, the more that identity would harden, and the harder it would be to shake off once he was ready to move on. So he began weighing his options. Could he keep sacrificing his creative drive just to stay in a beloved role? Or would walking away, despite all the risks, be the only way to reclaim his voice as an artist? Faced with a choice between comfort and creative suffocation, Richard began preparing himself for a difficult departure. The final straw came during contract negotiations. Richard, hoping for balance, requested a lighter filming schedule and more say in his character's evolution. In return, he was met with firm resistance. The producers were unwilling to adjust the formula. To them, John-Boy was irreplaceable, but also immovable. They wanted him exactly as he had been. No change, no growth. That was when Richard knew he had hit the wall. The show wasn't just unwilling to evolve with him, it was actively holding him back. He chose not to renew his contract. Quietly, respectfully, he stepped away. The network recast the role quickly, hiring Robert Whiteman to continue as John-Boy. But fans immediately noticed the difference. The new actor, though competent, lacked the emotional history Richard had built. Viewers felt betrayed, confused, and disconnected. Richard, however, maintained his professionalism. He said nothing negative. No interviews criticizing the show, no complaints about the recasting. His exit was as dignified as his performance, but those close to him understood the emotional toll. Leaving meant saying goodbye to years of relationships and memories, yet staying would have meant slowly losing himself. Adding to the pressure were whispers on set. Rumors began swirling that if Richard chose not to renew, the role of John-Boy would be recast. The thought was surreal. John-Boy was not just another role. It had been built from Richard's personality, his instincts, his emotional depth. But in the world of network television, characters were intellectual property, not people. And sure enough, once Richard declined to sign on, CBS moved quickly, selecting actor Robert Whiteman to replace him without offering much explanation to the public. The transition was abrupt. Viewers were confused. John-Boy's new face lacked the warmth and vulnerability audiences had grown attached to. Critics noted the change, and fans wrote in expressing frustration and disappointment. The bond they had formed with Richard's version of John-Boy was too personal to transfer. Still, Richard stayed silent. He never disparaged the actor or the show. Instead, he stepped away with quiet dignity, offering no scandal, no bitterness. He knew the decision would stir waves, but his instinct told him it was time. There was nothing left for him to give, not without sacrificing himself in the process. What most people never saw was how painful the decision had truly been. He had grown up on that set. The cast had become a second family. Walking away felt like leaving home, but staying would have meant sacrificing his voice, his ambition, and his emotional well-being. In the end, Richard chose integrity over comfort. He chose growth over stagnation. And while the cost was high, the decision was his alone. Leaving the Waltons wasn't the end of Richard Thomas's career. It was the beginning of a reinvention. He returned to the theater, embracing complex and often morally ambiguous characters. He took roles that pushed him, roles that surprised fans who only remembered John-Boy. In film and television, he explored darker, more emotionally layered parts. His role in You'll Like My Mother and later appearances in shows like The Americans, Ozark, and Billions earned critical praise. Slowly but surely, he shed the John Boy image and reasserted himself as a serious actor with broad range. The journey wasn't easy. Many casting agents still saw him as the good kid from TV. He faced rejection, but he kept working, and over time the industry began to respect his resilience. He never expressed regret. In interviews, he has said the decision to leave the Waltons was necessary. It allowed him to grow, to evolve, and to rediscover the joy of acting. At times, he seemed almost wistful when reflecting on those early years. He spoke of the show with warmth, calling it a blessing, but he never shied away from the truth that it had also been a limitation. He admitted to feeling creatively suffocated by the end and acknowledged that stepping away had left him emotionally drained. Still, there was no open regret. When asked years later if he would change anything about his decision, Richard simply said, "I needed to grow." It was not about turning his back on the role. It was about turning towards something new. As the years passed, the industry began to see him in a new light. He landed roles in acclaimed series like The Americans, Ozark, and Billions, where his performances were praised for their subtlety and power. He also returned to Broadway in well-regarded productions like The Little Foxes and Race, earning accolades for his stage work. In time, he built a career based not on one role, but on the strength of his craft. He became a true artist, quietly accomplished, deeply respected, and creatively fulfilled. Looking back, Richard Thomas speaks with clarity about his choice. He remembers the Waltons fondly. He praises the cast and acknowledges how important the show was to American television. But he's also honest about the emotional complexity of his exit. He's talked about how hard it was to walk away from something so beloved. But he also emphasizes that staying would have meant surrendering his artistic self. He now sees John Boy as a chapter, not the entire book. He's proud of what the role meant to audiences, but even prouder of the growth he achieved afterward. In recent years, he even returned to narrate the rebooted Walton specials, offering his voice but no longer needing to play the character. It was a full-circle moment, one that allowed him to honor his past without being trapped by it. In moments of rare vulnerability, he has talked about the weight of fan expectations and how long it took for casting agents to see him as anyone other than John Boy. He even once joked that he would walk into an audition room and feel the temperature shift, everyone wondering if the nice kid from the mountain could really handle anything different. And yet, there is no trace of resentment in his words. Instead, there is reflection. He talks about how the Waltons gave him a foundation, but not a full identity. That was something he had to fight for, and ultimately build on his own. Perhaps the most surprising thing is the peace he now carries about it all. Richard has made peace with John Boy, with fame, with the role that gave him everything and nearly boxed him in. Today, he embraces it, not as a limitation, but as a meaningful chapter in a much larger story. He has even returned to narrate the rebooted Waltons movies on the CW, bringing his connection full circle. It is not a case of going back, but of lending his voice to a new generation. It shows that while Richard no longer needs John Boy to define him, he respects what the role meant and still means to millions of viewers. Richard Thomas walked away not from success, but from limitation. In doing so, he claimed something greater: artistic freedom, personal peace, and a legacy built on authenticity. And in Hollywood, that kind of exit is rarer than fame itself.